So, what Sanjita asked me to speak about today was a little bit about how it's the structure of value chain organization that can set up the conditions for violence in the factories. And so, I wanted to take a step back from what you read and just situate what happens on the production floor, which is the spectrum of violence that was laid out in that paper, and then the kind of COVID-19 impacts of layoffs next to that. And that's really the site of violence in that paper, and in the corresponding report is what happens between the supplier factories and the workers. But there's a small paragraph in the paper you read where I mentioned that it's the choices of lead firms, both in terms of production targets, and also in terms of just the number of style seasons that come out each year that drive the sort of pace of production and the scale of production. Yeah. So it's the pace and the scale of production end up actually being based on the orders that lead firms place on fast fashion supply chains. So taking one step back from that, I just wanted to think a little bit together about why it is that lead firms get to make those choices on garment value chains. And so the argument that I'm going to share with you now is an argument that is actually forthcoming in a book that I've been working on with some colleagues that is called Reverse Subsidies, Gender and the Environment in Garment Global Value Chains, that should be out, I think, end of this year or next year. But basically what we're looking at in that book is how the structure of monopsony capitalism, where you have dominant lead firms in the market who are then employing many, many suppliers, creates a condition where those lead firms have uneven bargaining power. And what does that mean? It means that, so it's not quite a monopoly structure, but you have a cluster of lead firms, and they really get to see and set the market rate. Now, garment manufacturing in terms of supply chains is unique in the sense that it's not very high skilled work. So setting up a garment factory requires you to have less skilled workers and sort of less high skilled management, equipment, design, et cetera, for the kind of cut, make, and trim operations than, for instance, if you wanted to set up an IT export firm, where each of the people who were remote IT services would have a certain level of training. And it's because garment supplier factories actually, I mean, there's some cases, denim factories are able to add particular unique value. There are some sort of factories that will, and suppliers that will cater to niche markets, but for the most part, that's not the case. In the majority of fashion, and especially fast fashion, that skill is easily replicable, which means that the brand can move from supplier to supplier, and not only supplier to supplier within a garment cluster, but also supplier to supplier globally. So if it seems like the Bangladesh Suppliers Organization, the BGMEA, has more negotiating power in a particular moment because there is actually a collective of those suppliers, then perhaps the factory will, the brand will decide to source from the factory which isn't bargaining for certain conditions. And so it's that unequal bargaining relationship on the value chain to begin with that creates the conditions where brands set the prices, brands set the turnaround time, and brands set the scale of the order. And then zooming in on the supplier factory level, supplier factories have to meet those orders. And so what I had laid out in the chapter that you read in the book that on Bangladesh after Rana Plaza was basically, how does that violence manifest? And what are the different types of violence? And so the first thing I wanted to just step back and clarify is that there are two types of violence that I trace on garment supply chains, both of which are gendered forms of violence. And they're gendered either because it's women who are being targeted or because women are disproportionately impacted. Whether it's a targeting on the basis of gender or disproportional impact, we can argue that either of those processes are gendered. But the two kind of clusters of violence that we see is one, industrial discipline practices. So literally the types of verbal abuse that may escalate at times to physical violence, but daily barrages of pressure, abuse, stress that goes along with being driven to meet practically unmeetable production targets. And when those production targets are set, they're not set based on what's realistic for a garment worker in that factory to produce in a period of time. They're set on the basis of a sample tailor who's a very highly skilled tailor producing one piece. And then that is multiplied out by the amount of time that lower skilled workers have. So it's literally, they're being held to a target of someone who is a much more superiorly trained craftsperson, but also who's made one piece in that amount of time, who's not on repeat mode, performing the same task over and over and over again. And so that kind of costing and costing by piece is also something that takes place in the negotiation between suppliers and firms. But in order to meet those targets, you see a sort of relentless culture of verbal harassment, verbal abuse. And because there are, and this is where you actually, as people who are thinking about supply chains and supply chain responsibility, it's not just the force of the lead firm or the practices of the suppliers that you have to think about, but also how they interact with local conditions. And so when you have gendered workforce dynamics in a place where men tend to rise to higher supervisory roles, maybe specifically in India, which is where a lot of my work is concentrated, Dalit workers tend to be concentrated in the lowest level work. There are kind of natural hierarchies, and they're not natural actually, local hierarchies and local constructions of power that may be along gender lines, maybe along caste lines, but then production target pressure overlays on top of that. So you have men in a position of authority over women, many times from lower castes, lower classes, who are driving production targets that are set by the lead firms. And this really creates almost a pressure cooker environment. So those industrial discipline practices are one level of the violence that we see. Another, and that particular violence you can see actually permutate and escalate in a couple of different ways. One, when you have a sort of top-down culture of harassment, move from lower level bullying to a kind of higher levels of intensity of either physical violence, sexual violence, and harassment. That is a continuum that once you open up certain types of conduct, and this is in line with a lot of the scholarship on bullying more generally, low levels of harassment and violence in a workplace are actually gateways to more extreme forms of conduct. So that's where you may have the spin-off of sexual harassment, sexual violence, and those forms of gender-based violence. But another form of violence that emerges is a violence that I call employment practice-based violence. And so that's when women speak out, when they resist, when they say that, when they either resist an overture or they push back and insist on taking a bathroom break. Then you have retaliation in terms of employment practices, where they may be given even higher production targets. They may face a situation where they are suddenly held to a different standard than others, and they may actually lose their job in those situations where the retaliation takes a form of retaliation in relationship to their employment practice, which I would argue is also a form of coercion that meets a standard of violence. So with just about 3 minutes left, I just want to speak briefly about the types of choices that lead firms can make on value chains so that they can actually set up supplier relationships that are more sustainable in terms of workplace violence and other working conditions. And so one of the choices that lead firms can make is that they can make a decision to actually hold stable relationships with suppliers. So rather than moving to the lowest possible price point so that you can have the highest possible turnover in terms of quarterly shareholder values. If you establish more sustained relationships with a particular supplier, that gives the supplier bargaining power in terms of what are realistic production targets. It also gives a stability that allows them to upskill their workforce. And that begins to kind of level the playing field in terms of bargaining power. But it would also, having stable supplier relations, would also create a situation where a culture can be established between the lead firm and suppliers where proactive approaches in terms of working with women's collectives to identify types of violence and then actually take the steps to remediate them, where the lead firm, rather than exerting downward pressure on wages through production expectations, exacerbates local cultures of hierarchies and violence. The lead firm, with a more stable and established and longer term relationship, can actually create standards that it holds its suppliers to in terms of the types of working conditions, ranging from wages, hours, occupational health and safety, to gender-based violence and harassment. So I'll stop there.